I know you thought I'd be doing a piece now about Mel Stride, saying how the winter fuel cut is absurd and how the Conservatives are going to be the champion of the pensioners. Well, that's not what I'm going to do. I thought it was interesting to reflect a little on the Grenfell Tower tragedy and to focus not so much on the immediate factors that led to the disaster, but on the political context and the ideology that created the environment in which it was allowed to happen. The final report of the Grenfell Tower inquiry implicates a variety of actors, dishonest companies in different local authorities, a succession of governments dating back to 1991, but it reserves particular criticism for the administration of David Cameron. Indeed, while Theresa May's government had the unenviable task of managing the fallout, it was the policies and attitudes of Cameron's government that set the stage for the Grenfell disaster. And then it's the governments that come after Theresa May that failed to do anything about it. So that implicates David Cameron, then Johnson, Liz Truss, of course, and Rishi Sunak. These are the people who failed. And Cameron's deregulatory agendum, which he touted as a victory for cutting red tape and reducing the burden on businesses, is perhaps the most damning example of political dogma overriding common sense. And his administration introduced a one in, two out rule on new regulations in 2013, later expanding this to 1 in, 3 out in 2016. What sounds like a clever quip for reducing bureaucracy was in reality a disaster waiting to happen for public safety. There is bureaucracy that needs to be trimmed, but not safety. And the idea that every new safety regulation introduced, 2 or 3 must be removed, this shows a reckless disregard for the complexity of regulation, particularly when human lives are at stake. We don't get rid of bureaucracy on some sort of statistical calculation, as if removing bureaucracy is bureaucracy itself. We get rid of bureaucracy because it's unnecessary or because it's in the way. And so often we keep bureaucracy because we're keeping somebody's job. It's somebody's job to count these beans. Well, if we don't need the beans counting, then we don't need that job. The person can go off and do something else. And that's really the attitude that should pervade, rather than this sort of bean counting approach to getting rid of bureaucracy. It's nonsensical, and it's David Cameron. The Grenfell inquiry makes it clear that by 2016, the Department for Communities and Local Government, the DCLG, was fully aware of the risks posed by flammable cladding. However, due to the government's determined resistance to safety regulations, these concerns were ignored. And the inquiry points directly to Cameron's ideological obsession with reducing regulations, noting that even matters affecting the safety of life were ignored, delayed, or disregarded. In this way, Cameron's crusade against health and safety culture was not just a misstep, but a deeply cynical political stance. And if anybody has done more to perpetuate the tyranny of bureaucracy, it is the fact that David Cameron cut bureaucracy in the wrong place and has been found out. So his ideas might have sounded appealing to businesses frustrated with regulations, but they reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of why those regulations existed in the first place, to protect people. This bonfire of red tape metaphor, frequently employed by his government, symbolized a wild ignorance of the consequences of deregulation. He was reckless in a determined fashion. In the case of Grenfell, this ideology had deadly results. In comparison, Theresa May's role in the Grenfell disaster has been more associated with her government's ineptitude in dealing with the aftermath. She certainly deserves criticism for her failure to meet with survivors immediately after the tragedy and for the perceived indifference of her government. Absolutely. But the real villain when it comes to the broader systemic failings is Cameron. Just as maybe it's Cameron that lies behind the destruction of the Windrush papers. But Theresa May saw that through. Theresa May has plenty to feel sorry for, not least the hostile environment. But Cameron, it was under his watch that these regulations, which might have prevented the disaster, were weakened or scrapped altogether. And I'm afraid it's the same principle of looking at a statistic that lies behind the present government's decision to trim back the help for the elderly in heating. How do you means test that? Oh, well, if you're already receiving a benefit, then you can have heating. If you're not receiving a benefit, doesn't matter how much or how needy you may be, you don't get that help. You got that help until the beginning of this year, until the middle of this year, and then suddenly, out of the blue, it stopped, just as Christmas is approaching, when there isn't time to suddenly ferret up another £200 or £300. Give us the change at the beginning of the year. Give us a year run into that change. But don't impose it in a knee-jerk response. That is the stuff of David Cameron. That is the blindness of looking at the figures rather than looking at the reality of people. Keir Starmer, in his response to the Grenfell report, astutely noted that this is a moment to reflect on social justice in Britain. He's right. The deregulation Cameron championed wasn't just about cutting costs, it was about prioritising profits over people, businesses over safety, austerity over justice. This isn't just about a question of technical failings over poor implementation, it's a matter of ideology. Cameron's mission was to create a leaner, more efficient state, as he put it in 2013, and he left critical sectors under-resourced and ill-prepared for crises. And Cameron made the mistake. Keir Starmer recognises it. Keir Starmer should learn from his observation. Shouldn't he? Even after the tragedy, Cameron's legacy has lingered. For instance, the refusal to regulate fire risk assessors, despite calls from the fire sector, shows that the Grenfell disaster was not just an isolated failure, but part of a broader pattern of governmental neglect fostered during Cameron's premiership. If we examine the broader legacy of Cameron, his drive towards austerity and deregulation has continued to shape the political landscape. He's right that bureaucracy is overwhelming and needs to be trimmed. But he was trimming the wrong side. You don't trim bureaucracy because you want to trim bureaucracy. You trim bureaucracy because you want to free up the public, not free up business. By freeing up the public, yes, you might indirectly free up business, but you shouldn't be trapping the public in unnecessary bureaucracy. Find a simpler way to do it. Simplify the bureaucracy. But you don't have a calculation that, we get rid of all of that, and all of that, and all of that. That's day one. That's 3 bits of bureaucracy gone. Have I reached my total for today? Yes, I have. No, that's not how you get rid of bureaucracy. You get rid of bureaucracy by asking whether or not this is useful. Does it contribute to our society? And if it doesn't, get rid of it. The same thing is true of laws. We can't have laws on the statute book that do not contribute to our society. Get rid of them. Repeal them. Because if they're still around, they're going to mess up future courts. They're going to mess up the business of justice. Because somebody will use that law in a way that wasn't intended. No, we don't use that law now. Well, why is it around? Get rid of it if you're not using it. tidy up the workplace. And, public public sector cuts, outsourcing, the erosion of safety standards, they're all part of that larger plan of Cameron's to permanently shrink the role of the state. But look at that word right in the middle, outsourcing. Isn't that exactly what Suella Braverman was trying to do with Rwanda? Priti Patel as well. As Starmer's Labour government seeks to undo much of the damage by restoring public ownership and improving workers' rights, Grenfell stands as a painful reminder of the consequences of Cameron's small government vision. And yet, Starmer doesn't seem to have learnt from what Cameron did. Because Starmer's approach to the pensioners is not so far removed from Cameron's approach to cladding. So while Theresa May's role in Grenfell is undeniable, it's David Cameron who shoulders the greater responsibility for creating the conditions that allowed the tragedy to happen. His relentless focus on blind deregulation, reducing the state's role, directly contributed to the failures in safety that led to the deaths of 72 people. Grenfell wasn't just a failure of fire safety, it was a failure of a political ideology. It was an obsession with statistics rather than people. And that is the problem that Starmer seems to be overlooking. Statistics rather than people. We need to put people first. All the time we put people first. And then we get rid of the bureaucracy that doesn't matter. Rather than putting bureaucracy first and finding some sort of statistics to deal with bureaucracy. Nonsense. You can't get rid of bureaucracy by adding more bureaucracy or by looking at it bureaucratically. You get rid of bureaucracy by focusing on what is more important, which is people. And bureaucracy is there to serve the people, not to bully the people, to serve the people. Bureaucracy needs to be put in its place. And that's something that Cameron didn't do. Because in the end, when you are the person in charge, bureaucracy is a useful tool. And that's the problem. All governments find bureaucracy extremely useful because it hides their mistakes and because it commands the people. We need a government that is serving the people and is aware that bureaucracy is there to serve the government, to serve the servers. Instead, we have governments which are obsessed with authority. The real villain in the Grenfell story is not simply the government that managed the aftermath, but the one that dismantled the protections that could have prevented the disaster in the first place. The real villain in the pension scandal, which is on the way, is the person who dismantles the payment that leads to pensioners in hospital in a few months' time. Because actually, as I discovered last night and today, getting seen in hospital is a nightmare. Whether you're a pensioner or whether you're a child, schoolboy or whatever, schoolgirl, doesn't matter. You'll be waiting hours. For what? To be given the wrong information. What was ironic about the story about the hospital visit last night was a man who was going, his wife was eventually told that he'd been on the wrong medicine anyway. For years. You think, does nobody check? So who does she believe? The hospital that keeps her waiting, or the GP on whom she's supposed to rely? How do we know? We are not health experts. How do we know if we don't have all our paperwork, if we don't have access to the bureaucracy, if the bureaucracy is held above us like some sort of god, how do we know that it's right? We need to trim the bureaucracy to what is necessary, and then we need to be able to control it. We should not be controlled by the bureaucrats.